According to a recent report published by Oxfam, the most recent report indicates that up to 1% rather of the global population grabbed nearly 2/3 of all new wealth created since 2020. This amounted to $42 trillion US. Meanwhile, during the past decade, the richest 1% had captured around half of all new wealth. Let's get into that report. We're now joined by Kwesi Obeng, Regional Program Advisor, Inequality, Oxfam in West Africa. Kwesi, thank you very much for availing yourself this afternoon. As you open the report, you note we are living through an unprecedented moment of multiple crises. These multiple crises all have winners. Let's start with how this report was put together.
Well, so this is the 10th year we've been publishing this report, published around the time of Davos. Essentially, it's based on a number of sources, including some of the major databases around the world, including from the World Bank, IMF, OECD. So it's something we've been doing for the past 10 years, and so we're quite clear about the methodology to arrive at these conclusions. And as you rightly said, it's an unprecedented bonanza for the millionaires and billionaires, the wealthiest 1% in the world. From the database, it's quite clear that since the COVID started, actually in the last 3 years, the richest 1% in the world have essentially worth more than 2/3 of all the wealth created. In other words, twice as much as the rest of the 99% of the world. So it's an unprecedented. And if you look at it against the backdrop of the fact that we are in the middle of once in a century event, crisis, pandemic, coupled with food and energy crisis and inflation that we haven't seen since 2008 financial crisis. It's just surprising that governments would allow a tiny few of the world's population to basically cream off at the expense of 99% of the world. It's just dreadful and just unacceptable, given the crisis in which the bulk of the world's population is living. I mean, cost of living, it's gone up right across the world from developing to developed countries. And so, yes, it's that stark in terms of the evidence.
And then you also, in the report, attempt to get to the bottom of the problem. You note that every billionaire is a policy failure, going on to say for too long, governments, international financial institutions and elites have misled the world with a fictional story about trickle-down economics in which low tax and high gains for a few would ultimately benefit us all. It is a story without any basis in truth.
Well, this is the fact. Every one billionaire is as a result of a policy failure around the world. And just to put this thing in perspective, now, over the past 40 years, a generation, we've seen, this push around basically pulling down the tax level for the richest 1% in the world. This push for tax cuts for the richest. In other words, this neoliberal logic that as you cut tax for the richest, it will trickle down to the rest of the population. 40 years, a generation, we've seen the failure of this. It's actually a time of harvest of that failed policy prescription, which has been led essentially by the IFIs and the rich countries of this world, particularly the IMF and the World Bank, pushing countries to basically push down their tax rates. And as we speak, very few countries really tax wealth around the world, and from developing to rich countries. And so we're suggesting from the report that it's a policy failure. But an interesting bit is that there are solutions. It's not as if countries and governments are paralyzed and therefore can't do anything about it. There are alternative solutions to fix the current crisis. And so we also provide that scope in terms of what could be done, and based on the lessons from the past 40 years, to address this lopsided accumulation of wealth by a tiny few. And that's also one other point one needs to make, that this accumulation in the hands of a tiny few, it's cross-intersectional. It intersects with gender, with race and colonialism. And I can break it further down. If you look at the 1,000 richest people on earth, only 125 of them are women. And guess what? Only 5 are blacks. So it has a particular face, and it's intersectional in many ways, with some of the accumulation of power over the past decades and centuries, if you like. And so we really need to break this cycle, the report points out. And we can come back to some of the solutions that we propose to fix the current crisis.
I'd like for us to take a look at those solutions now, because you also note Elon Musk, one of the world's richest men, paid a true tax rate of just over 3% from 2014 to 2018. Abba Christine, a market trader in northern Uganda who sells rice, flour and soya, makes $80 a month in profit. She pays a tax rate of 40%. How to fix this, if at all?
Well, so, I mean, it's interesting, but we can, just to break that figure down. So the $80 that Amber Christine makes is barely 1,350 rand, right? And she pays as much as 540 rand of that in taxes. And the richest, one of the richest men on earth, you see the intersectional thing I was talking about. The richest man, one of the richest men in the world, pays less than 3% of his wealth, in tax annually. And that is simply not fair. So coming back to the broader context. So in terms of some of the solutions, as I indicated earlier, wealth in most countries are not taxed. And yet labor is heavily taxed. And that is part of the reason why today, whilst cost of living is on the rise and many families are unable to feed themselves, basically the super rich can do anything they want. And just a couple of things. Now, as we speak, from the data, if we just tax wealth, and here we're talking of property taxation, property taxes, tax on dividends, and the like, we could, if we just placed a flat rate of 5% on the wealth of the richest on earth, the 1%, we could raise close to $1.7 trillion. That is enough to push at least 1.7, basically to end hunger in the world and raise at least the 2 billion people that are going to bed hungry out of the current state. In fact, every 1 in 8 person on earth goes to bed hungry, essentially because they don't have the means to be able to just put food on the table. And many of these are young children and women, particularly in rural areas, in most parts of the world. It's not just simply in Africa, but across the world. But as I indicated, there are solutions. One of them is what I just talked about. A simple flat rate of 5%. And you know that workers pay close to 25% on their income. How come the richest on earth that have made so much wealth in the last 3 years, and mind you, this comes also on the back of incredible wealth made by the tiny few. If you would recall, in the around 2002, there was a time when the mining companies were saying, let the good times roll, essentially when they were making windfall profits. This is a windfall profit for the richest of the, amongst us, and they don't want to be taxed. And we're suggesting that they ought to be taxed fairly and pay their fair share, so the world we can all live in a decent society. And also just to make the point that, the evidence, the empirical evidence points to the fact that when there is such a high level of inequality, no one is safe, because it puts everybody in danger. And it's therefore in the interest of even the super rich to ensure that they also pay a decent fare of the taxes that everybody else, the 99% of the rest of the world, pays.
Mr. Obeng, let's take a look at page 8 of your report. There is a graphic there, personal income tax rates for the rich, which includes the continent. What are we looking at? What does that talk to?
Well, so the evidence shows that indeed the richest amongst us in the world simply have a way of going around and avoiding paying taxes on their wealth. And two things. One is that it's not as if, the richest or the wealthiest amongst us woke up one morning in 2020 and became smarter than the rest of us, or began to work harder than the rest of us, or became more entrepreneurial than the rest or the 99%. No, it's structural. And so we're suggesting, and the report recommends, a structural fix to this crisis. If you look at the international financial architecture, it basically favors the 1% against the 99%. What I'm saying is that the international financial architecture is structured in such a way that the richest, or those who make the most wealth, are able to evade paying taxes and making their contributions, particularly to the communities from where they derive the wealth. And so we're suggesting that they ought to pay a decent or a fair share of the taxes. And that's why we come back to that recommendation to pay at least a minimum of 5% to address the imbalance. And as I said, we could raise $1.7 trillion in a year, and that's about a third of Africa's GDP, which is just a little below $5 trillion.
Mr. Obeng, 10 years on, we keep hearing the same story, and so is there any effect to such reports? Very quickly for us.
Well, yes, absolutely. You would just a couple of months ago, you probably read or might be aware of what the UN did. The UN accepted, basically, UN members agreed to set up a new global body that would basically take hold of the current lopsided international architecture, which has been, spearheaded by the OECD, the Club of Rich Countries, which tends to protect their interests.
Unfortunately, and I do beg your pardon, we're hoping to invite you soon to maybe explore this further. Kwesi Obeng is the Regional Program Advisor, Inequality, Oxfam in West Africa.